A people that values its privileges above its principles soon loses both. Dwight D. Eisenhower, and that was from Goodreads.com. Before I continue, the sources that I used are Goodreads.com, World War II United States Experience.com, World War II Historyblog.wordpress.com, www.loc.gov, www.buyandhold.com, BronyQuote.com, History.com, HistoryMatters.gmu.edu. Alright, so I'm Jacob Wright, and today I'm going to tell you about Dwight D. Eisenhower and some of his accomplishments, obstacles he overcame, and some of his benefits to society. In preparing for battle, I have always found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. That was also Dwight Eisenhower. That was also from Goodreads.com. So some of his accomplishments. He led the Allies in the North Africa campaign during World War II, and he was in charge over the United States and the United Kingdom's forces, and he single-handedly defeated Erwin Rommel, who was one of the greatest German generals ever. And then after, he was given command to invade Sicily. And then after the successful beach landings there, he proceeded to liberate all of Italy. Due to his successes there, he was named the first ever Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. It was the first of that name, and he led all of the Allied forces in Europe from then on. He then planned with his other generals the D-Day invasions. And after landing there, he proceeded to lead the U.S. and British forces throughout the liberation of France. And the sources were World War II United States Experience.com and World War II Historyblog.wordpress.com. After the war was over, he ran for election for the presidency in 1952. He only ran because the Republican Party convinced him that it was his duty to do so, because he was a very duty-driven man. He won by a landslide and became president in 1953. While president, he created the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare to just help poor people and improve education in the United States. One of his biggest programs was the interstate highway system that really he alone decided was important for the nation. And he also created NASA to compete with the Soviet Union in the space race. It was the very beginning, he was really his brainchild. And then when the Korean War started, he had to go into negotiations and force North Korea and China to back down and agree to an armistice. He had to threaten nuclear retaliation if they wouldn't back down. So that was really mostly on him. And the source was www.loc.gov. But Dwight D. Eisenhower really had to overcome several obstacles to get to that point. So some of his obstacles: he had no combat experience in World War I, despite several times requesting transfer. During World War II, it was a heavy point of contention between him and other army officers, especially with the British, because almost all of the British officers and generals were World War I veterans, and they had led forces in World War I, and so to them, being led by an inexperienced American was just unacceptable. When he became Supreme Commander in Europe, he was forced to unite several different allied nations, which was a very difficult task. But he did so very well, and he was really probably one of the only men in the world who could have done so at that time. Again, another obstacle was invading and landing on Normandy to invade France and to liberate it. He had to again deal with Erwin Rommel and all of the remaining Nazi Germany's might. And again, all of these operations required just great cooperation between America and all the other allied nations. On D-Day, the British had some beaches, America had some, and even Canada had another beach, let alone having to unite the French resistance forces and several other less important nations in the world. The sources for that were History.com. But other than that, he also had to deal with several health issues. His quote in one of his biographies was, "I had thrust upon me the unpleasant fact that I was indeed a sick man." He had a massive heart attack in 1955 that left him unable to walk for a little over a month, and he was unable to work at all for 2 weeks, and his vice president had to run the country temporarily while he was in the hospital. The Republican Party was very fearful that he would not be able to run for re-election, but knowing that it was his duty for the good of the nation, he did anyways. Sources were buyandhold.com. Neither a wise man nor a brave man lies down on the tracks of history to wait for the train of the future to run over him. Dwight D. Eisenhower. And that was from brainyquote.com. So beyond that, he also had several benefits to society that still last to this day. One of his biggest was the Federal Aid Highways Act of 1956 that he signed in June 29th. He proposed this legislation and signed it once it went through Congress, and basically created a 41,000-mile national system of interstate and defense highways. It promoted trade and increased safety, but also part of the safety part was it allowed the armed forces to mobilize far greater than before. Before, there were really dirt roads and some paved roads, but they were not very coordinated between the states. And so one of his big purposes was if America was ever attacked by, at that time most of the Soviet Union was a big concern, was that the army could mobilize anywhere across the country with the new highway system. Also, a big fear was nuclear war. They feared that some of the big cities would be hit by nukes from the Soviet Union. So the idea was that if the roads were big enough and were well enough maintained, then more people could escape the big cities when the nukes dropped. So today we should really give more thanks to Eisenhower for our highways, which is something we really overlook. That was from history.com. He also, although he's really not known for it, he also made several victories for civil rights. He alone really pushed to integrate the armed forces after Truman, the previous president, had failed to do so. He also, which is another thing Truman failed to do, he also desegregated Washington, D.C. And then as president, he nominated the liberal Earl Warren judge. This is the judge that was really one of the biggest people in the Brown case, which ended segregation and really started to dismantle the Jim Crow laws. He proposed and signed the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which really jump-started the civil rights movement as a whole, and also gave the federal government some leeway in trying to force desegregation when the states were refusing to do so. He was also the president during the Little Rock crisis, which was when Arkansas governor deployed the National Guard to prevent some black students from attending school there. And he had to actually, use the army to force the National Guard to stand down and force the segregation. And that was from historymatters.gmu.edu. So in conclusion, Dwight D. Eisenhower was a man driven by duty that managed to achieve the highest levels of power. He changed the world in his time as a general and as a president, and his legacy lives on in the interstate highway system and civil rights achievements. Thank you.